Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 132. We're talking about a subject that I actually have never really enjoyed talking about, supplements. People always have questions about them, and unfortunately, they don't always do their homework. And in an unfortunately unregulated industry, we often see some really shady fly-by-night operations. So fortunately, we've got a great representative from Examine.com here to kind of talk us through some of the scarier parts of the industry and also give us some insights on what to look for to make sure that the supplements you are taking are both safe and effective. I think this is a really good show, and I actually picked up some good stuff on it. I'm sure you will too. In lieu of a sponsor this week, I wanted to highlight a great offer from some people I really trust. For the past decade, I've been telling people to go to examine.com for all things supplements. I've even recommended them on my blog and podcast dozens of times. Very simply, Examine is an interdisciplinary team of researchers focused only on the science with no conflict of interest. They aren't owned by a bigger parent company. They don't have investors or sponsors they have to answer to. They don't sell supplements or even ad space on their website. They don't recommend brands or specific products, either as a company or as individuals. What they do is distill thousands of scientific studies into actionable insights so you can improve your health and the health of the people you care about. I was already a fan, but they've just launched Examine 2.0. With it, they've expanded past just supplement information, but now they also have a database that grades the research on supplements and health conditions and outcomes. It includes summaries of their latest research, frequently asked conditions around the nutrition and health realms, and more. They made it much easier to stay on top of the latest research in the realms of health and human performance by covering 25 different health categories, nearly 400 health conditions and goals, over 1,000 health outcomes and parameters, and over 500 interventions, mostly relating to supplements. Along the way, you can also pick up continuing education credits. And it's on sale for a great introductory offer this week through my link, www.examine.news/Cressey. Usually, you'd be looking at $29 per month or $199 per year. And right now, for this week only, it will be $19 per month and $144 per year during the sale, which ends on August 25th. Don't miss this chance to enroll at a great discount with a resource that I've found to be really good over a long period of time. Again, that link is examine.news/Cressey, Cressey. I guarantee that you won't be disappointed. Today's guest is the editor of study summaries at Examine.com. Prior to working with Examine, he studied chemistry and biochemistry at Middlebury College and earned a master's degree in medical science and public health from the University of Vermont. He's fascinated by the art and science of human improvement, especially as seen through the lenses of medicine, nutrition, fitness, and mindfulness. An avid lifter, he also participates in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Please welcome to the show, Nick Milazzo.
In terms of an overview of what I do at Examine and what Examine is, the kind of quick pitch is basically that Examine is the largest database of nutrition research and supplement research on the internet. And sort of our point of pride at Examine is that we have no conflicts of interest whatsoever. So that means we don't take any money from any sources. There's no venture capital, there's no private equity, there's no sponsorships. So it's something that we're really proud of, being able to say that, like, look, like, the only thing that we do to support our business is our subscription service. So we have no incentive whatsoever to basically do anything besides create something that's really good, and provides truth and clarity, in a field that frankly can be pretty, the waters can be pretty turbid. It can be hard to know
Absolutely.
what's true.
It's a remarkably unregulated industry. I'm curious, how did you wind up going down this path? What was it that drew you, A, to research, but B, this particular facet of research in the health and human performance world?
Yeah. So I guess, broadly speaking, I kind of feel like a consistent part of my own life has just been this sort of real excitement about the process of coming to understand things. So even in school, like, writing papers was something I always loved doing, because I felt like being able to sit down, read a big body of research or whatever, and then find a way to sort of distill it into something that you can communicate clearly about, particularly in written language, is just immensely satisfying. And frankly, I think it's probably one of the truest tests of whether or not you know something. When it comes to working with Examine specifically, I actually was a big fan of them for years, and I first went on their site when I started lifting, and I was like, all right, like, what's creatine, and I really appreciated the fact that, like, just like today, it was information that was delivered in a way that was clear and concise, and it was information I knew I could trust. When it came to my interest in sort of health and human performance, a lot of that is related to a combination of the fact that I was actually like a pre-med student for a really long time. So I was gearing up for med school. My fiance is actually in med school right now, and she's well, let's just say that she helped me confirm the fact that that wasn't the path I wanted to take. I liked being able to really dig into a subject, and moving so quickly across so many different subjects was something that just wasn't tremendously satisfying to me. But then from a performance standpoint, I was a collegiate rower, and I actually left my crew team in my senior year and rowed independently for a year. So, there was a good combination of getting to be my own athlete and be my own coach, and obviously dietitian. All of those roles were basically me.
Yeah.
And so it was really fun. So it was a nice confluence of sort of this like intellectual fascination with the subject, and then also this very like physical task of like, okay, like this is my chance to really test my knowledge. Like, am I feeding myself the right way? Am I taking the right supplements? Am I exercising correctly? Am I doing the right rehab? So yeah, that's kind of what, broadly speaking, drew me to this path. And I felt like when it came to wanting to be involved in this type of work, frankly, Examen's the only place that exists that I know of that
Mhm.
allows me to do all of that work in a way that is completely devoid of any sort of ulterior motives, which I really
Yeah.
appreciate.
And I think the conflict of interest is an important consideration. We'll definitely talk about that later. But
Yeah.
the thing that fascinates me, and literally, it's fresh in my mind. I had this conversation today with a college athlete and his father who came back, and we worked with him in high school, and he came back, and he discovered freshman year nutrition is not easy in college. It's excuse me, it's a different geography. It's cafeterias where you don't know what you're going to get. Just and not that he's an athlete, so there's road games and things like that. And I was really intrigued where, one of the comments was, he just didn't, we got all his supplements, and I think his dad actually called it all his pills. He didn't stay on top of it, and it was almost like they assigned, blame to the supplement side of things being the problem. And it's like, hey, there's a whole lot of calories that supported the fact that you lost, 12 pounds since you left for school in the fall or whatever it is. So I think it kind of begs this question of, what's the point of supplements in the first place? Most people really don't ask this question before they, race off to the store or hit Amazon and start purchasing them like crazy.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I think, broadly speaking, to me, it's worth just kind of saying like, well, the reason you're taking a supplement is because you think it's going to help you get something you want. And they can, which is good. But then getting a little bit more specific, when you think about, well, what's the point of taking supplements? I like to think about it as you're trying to produce an improvement in some outcome. And so the outcome could be something like muscle mass or, 100-meter sprint time, whatever. Um, but then thinking about how can we be more specific about what those outcomes actually are, I think it's useful to think about it as basically being, you have general outcomes and you have specific outcomes. So a general outcome might be something like, I want to avoid illness. I want to feel better. A
Mhm.
specific outcome might be like, I want to put on 5 pounds of muscle, or I want my joints to hurt less because I have, because I play baseball, my shoulder hurts. You can also think about outcomes in terms of time scales. So you can have these short time scales like, okay, I want to crush my next workout. So what do I need to do? Or I want to feel calmer when I'm about to, go up and compete because I'm feeling stressed out. And then long time scales would be things like, I want to live longer. I want to lower my risk of developing cardiovascular disease because my dad got it or something like that. And so I think it's useful to kind of use this framework to uh, contextualize your goals for taking supplements, because being specific about the nature of the outcome that you're interested in is going to be really informative when it comes to choosing what you take. Um, and so, obviously, ideally, short and specific outcomes are pretty appealing, right? Like, you're most likely to notice when they work and when they don't work. If you take a pre-workout that has like a ton of caffeine in it, and then you are fired up when you're lifting, like that's you don't have to be tremendously sensitive to notice a change there.
Mhm.
General outcomes are kind of a funny situation, especially long-term ones, because a lot of the times it's more like you're, brushing your teeth. Like, you're
Mhm.
not doing this because you think it's going to yield a benefit. Rather, you think it's going to help stave off something negative. Um, and so that's kind of those are also worth targeting, but at the same time, it's harder to notice when things are working.
Yeah, I think and it's confounding because a lot of times it's always an n equals one. You know what I mean? We certainly have the research that supports it, but all right. So it's 2022 while we're recording this. I have been on creatine for 21 years consecutively,
Right.
nonstop. Right? I've been on creatine since before they started using it to prevent muscle loss in astronauts in outer space. Since before they started saying, hey, maybe it'll work for grandma and all these different things. I've always done it. And being candid, I can't say I ever noticed a difference taking it.
Right.
And this is back in the era where they were telling everybody you load it like crazy and everything. And I took it because I like to lift heavy stuff, and I knew that it would help me lift more heavy stuff, and have higher quality outcomes. And I knew we had done a bunch of the research in our lab at UConn about safety and all that. So I was very confident as long as I took from a reputable company that was something that would work. And I also knew it was a naturally occurring substance. But by that same token, I knew people back in, I mean, we're talking 2001. Like there were people that were convinced that it was like taking an anabolic steroid, that they
Right.
took it and they were a different person the next day. And obviously there's an element of placebo effect there, but there's certainly likely an element of individual response, that some people, maybe I ate more red meat than them or whatever it was. There's different variations. So, I mean, does that make it hard to really help people separate out like these timelines? You talked about like, more this chronic adaptation of brushing your teeth versus like actually going to the dentist and walking out with, whiter teeth.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's so to me, like when it comes to a lot of this stuff, I think kind of looking inwards and thinking about like what is it, all you get is an N of one,
Mhm.
as far as we know. And you are gonna have to accept the fact that you're working with imperfect data because you don't get to run the same experiment multiple times over. And so I think that it's important to sort of consider like there's certain types of interventions where I'm not likely to see an effect, even if an effect is present, right? So like obviously in scientific research, like effect sizes, like a small effect size is one that is definitely present, but also not one that's likely to be noticed. So I think that when it comes to making decisions about what you want to take, part of it is like, well, how badly do I need to notice this
Mhm.
improvement?
That's a
Am
great
I
point.
willing to right? And am I willing to invest? You know, like creatine's a good example because
Yeah.
it's cheap. And so you say like, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to directly notice the fact that I'm adding 5 pounds to my deadlift over, the course of, 6 weeks or whatever. But you could say, well, it's cheap enough where I'm kind of willing to like
Yeah.
tolerate the possible fact that I'm wasting my money on this because it's just not that big of a deal to me. But that could change based off of your financial situation or your own level of health, your own level of kind of desperation around seeing an effect. So yeah, like I think that specific supplement, like looking at scientific research and sort of saying like, well, what magnitude of effect am I likely to see, and
Mhm.
is that going to be satisfying enough to encourage me to take it? Is definitely an important question. It is a very personal question, particularly if you're just someone who's looking to be healthier or fitter or whatever on your own. Obviously, like if you're in charge of whether or not someone on your entire team takes a supplement, it's kind of like, well, it's probably less important what the individual
Yeah.
athletes think. But yeah,
It has,
especially if you're
yeah.
doing this for yourself.
It has to be more thought out, I think, is the key emphasis from this discussion is, don't just throw darts, like have a rhyme and a reason, ask the right questions, understand timelines versus performance based versus, general health outcomes. All those things are very different, and certainly they're context dependent. Like a strength and power athlete is probably going to benefit more from creatine than, folks in potentially other sports. So, maybe that leads into our next question is, what type of, so when you look at research, maybe outline the different types of studies in terms of design that
Mhm.
are there. How should they be valued and compared with one another?
Yeah. So once again, starting from a big picture level, supplement studies are typically one of two things. So you have interventional studies, and these are studies where you took a specific group of people, you gave your supplement to some of them, and either gave a placebo or nothing to the rest of them, and then you recorded the difference between them. So if you're looking at a study and it says something like randomized controlled trial, that's an example of an interventional study. Um, Observational studies are the other type, and those are basically saying we're not going to actually deliver an intervention ourselves. we're going to look at people who naturally separate themselves into the two groups we're interested in. So we might say like, okay, let's get a population of people who take vitamin D, and let's look at a population of people who don't take vitamin D, and then try to compare those. So the major advantage of interventional studies is that you can make causal claims. So you could say creatine causes an increase in power output. And you're not allowed to do that with observational research for, I guess, what boils down to sort of like rigorous, but still ultimately philosophical reasons.
Yeah.
And then the major advantage of observational studies, because losing the ability to make a causal claim is like kind of a shame. But the advantage to observational studies is that they allow you to study stuff even when an interventional trial isn't feasible. And that could be due to a lot of reasons, right? So it could be due to ethical issues, like it wouldn't be ethical to knowingly deprive one group of an essential vitamin, or to dramatically underfeed protein or something like that. There could also just be practical issues, like maybe it'd be really expensive, or it would take forever for us to notice something. Like if you want to study intermittent fasting for longevity, right? Like, are you realistically going to be able to conduct a trial where you have, 500 people do intermittent fasting for the rest of their lives and see if they live longer? So you kind of have these two broad categories. When it comes to subtypes of interventional studies, there can be a decent amount of variation, but generally speaking, the types of stuff that you're looking for are like double or triple blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials. And basically all that means is that they had a control group that received a placebo, which allows you to account for the possible placebo effect, right? People that, somehow showing an effect even if they weren't given the treatment. And then the blinding is related to basically saying like the people didn't know what they were taking, the researchers didn't know what they were taking, the people analyzing the data didn't know what we were taking. All we did was compare, and we didn't actually figure out who received what until we unblinded at the end of the study. So it's all just kind of structural tools that can be used to reduce the possibility that humans with their inherent biases will inadvertently, or I guess advertently, manipulate information beforehand. When it comes to observational studies, you have things like cohort studies, which are generally considered a stronger type of study. You also have things like cross-sectional studies, which is basically saying we just took a snapshot and we compared two groups at a single time point. When it comes to sort of an actionable concept with all of this, I would say if you are not in a situation where you are capable of like really closely evaluating the quality of research, you are best off defaulting to a study that is interventional and is ideally a double or triple blind placebo-controlled randomized trial. And it's not conducted in a population that is, well, I guess it is conducted in a population that is relevant to you. So if you're a strength athlete and you want to see, how something affects strength athletes, looking at, I don't know, a study conducted in, people with type 2 diabetes is probably not exactly what you're interested in. And then ideally, the study should also have no industry funding or kind of industry support whatsoever, because that does increase the risk of flattering findings. That's not always realistic, but sometimes we got to take what we can get. But ideally, there's no ulterior motives moving around. Actually, that's basically those are kind of the big concepts. Unfortunately, there's a lot of context and a lot of detailed analysis that needs to be done. But kind of the skill level required to sort of really dig into those things is probably higher than what most people get exposure to.
I'm curious, and this is maybe a hard question to answer. And having written my master's thesis, I've submitted to scholarly journals and been involved in some publications over the years. And it's a rigorous process. You submit, they ask questions about your method, you clarify, you resubmit. And I did that with my master's thesis. And even when we were submitting to a journal where one of my committee members was actually editor of the journal, like they were hard on it. They challenged it. I'm curious, how many studies just never see the light of day, and how often do you come across something that is egregiously conflict of interest? Is that something that's a very regular finding? And I think that's a very important consideration, because we both know You walk into most supplement stores, and the claims are pretty outrageous, and that's in part
Right.
because the regulation is very different. But when we hear these companies saying, this is proven in a scientific study, like very often it was internally conducted, things like that.
Right. Yeah. So I think the first part of that question that I want to address is related to the presence of conflict of interest. And it varies a lot by subject matter. So, for those who don't know, one of the big services that we offer at Examine is called Study Summaries. I'm the editor of Study Summaries. And we cover a lot of different nutrition and supplement research that
Yeah.
isn't explicitly related to sports performance. So, like beauty related research
Mhm.
is a really good example of I don't know. I would say upwards of 90% of the studies have at least some degree of industry involvement. And that might mean, oh, a company donated their product to be studied, or it could be like the scientists who conducted the study are on our payroll. So the severity of it can vary quite a bit, but we consider all of these things to be conflicts of interest, and we label them as such because there is actually maybe I can send you the paper and you can like link to it in your show notes or
Yeah.
something. But there's this really good paper that came out like probably about 2 years ago at this point that was talking exactly about how even something as simple as having donated the product can influence the likelihood that the findings favor the supplement that was
Yeah.
studied. So that's kind of the first part. And I would say like when it comes to sports performance stuff, I tend to find that a lot of food products have funding. So when you talk about things like uh, flavonoid or anthocyanin studies, it's usually like, oh yeah, this kind of this blueberry company or this company that makes tart cherry juice or whatever was involved. Things related to like whey protein don't tend to be as bad. But yeah, it's very variable. Unfortunately, not, most scientific papers are not available to the public, but typically authors do include at least some type of conflict of interest statement on the abstract of their study, which should be available to the public.
It's fascinating because I think we both know, like we joke in the baseball world, like there's a college for everybody. Like if you want to
Right.
be a college baseball player, I promise there is a college you could play at. You and I could go play college baseball somewhere today. And honestly, it might even extend to professional baseball. If you're willing to live in the middle of nowhere and
Right.
lose money to play professional baseball, you can probably be a professional baseball. The thing that scares me is that's to some degree the same with scholarly journals. There are more than you and I could possibly spend a career counting. And you see some of these studies, and I'm like, I have never heard of that journal. Don't know who publishes it, don't know who the editor is, don't know where it's based, anything like that. Is that a very legitimate problem? Is that just knowing that the standards for some journal are markedly different than others?
100%. Yeah. So there are the most egregious version of this is there are what are considered predatory journals that exist that charge a really high fee to the researchers for submitting their publications. They tend to have very kind of fast and loose review processes, if any. So that definitely exists, and that's a big problem. But in some ways, because it's a slightly more obvious problem, it's almost less of an overall problem, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The thing to me that I find the most concerning when it comes to the way that scientific publication works is the fact that there is very little funding dedicated towards supporting high quality papers and carrying them through the review process. So reviewers are typically not paid for the papers they review. I personally believe that absent kind of a good incentive, reviewers are not likely to catch stuff. So just kind of a law of large numbers thing. It's like, hey, like you might be a super prestigious journal, you might have some really heavy hitting research groups contributing, but like people make mistakes. It's a normal part of being a person. And I don't believe that there are enough structural elements in place to adequately catch issues. So the study that I referenced before, talking about conflicts of interest, I would argue that that represents a pretty significant issue with study quality, and those were the top 10 nutrition journals. And it's very common, especially in exercise science and nutrition and supplements and stuff, to find studies that have very considerable issues in
Mhm.
very opulent journals. So, and it's hard because you want to be able to provide some sort of actionable, uh, some sort of like guide for people who are
Yeah.
looking to understand this world. And frankly, it's like it's complicated, and
Yeah.
there's a lot going on. There's a lot to pay attention to, and basically, like what we try to do is act as a bit of a guiding light, kind of a lighthouse in the fog, so to speak,
It's
because there's
important.
just so much to keep track of.
It's important, and especially because as you kind of imply it, it covers multiple industries, right? There's an element of the beauty industry under supplements. There's
Yeah,
obviously nutrition component. We see in strength and conditioning journals, basically, how does this supplement interact with performance or body composition or something like that? So you're kind of looking across, multiple disciplines as you try to evaluate it. I'm sure there are good journals and less than stellar journals in all of those different disciplines.
yeah.
But I'm curious, like how how can the research actually be misleading about the efficacy of a supplement? Like I'm sure there are ways when bad data gets cooked to the benefit of a company.
Right, right, 100%. And so when it comes to researchers being deliberately misleading about stuff, one of the things that can be a decent red flag is the absence of pre-registration. So it's not always the case that pre-registration is important, but it can be worth paying attention to. So for people who don't know, pre-registration is basically you just saying to a third party, and it's usually like clinicaltrials.gov, or there are other kind of non-governmental pre-registration sites. But you just say, hey, I'm going to conduct a study. This is who it's going to be in. This is the intervention. This is the stuff I'm going to track. So it keeps you accountable as a researcher. One of the things that can happen when a study isn't pre-registered is that you conduct your study, you run some statistical tests to see if your differences like between groups were significant, and you end up just reporting the things that showed up as significant, and just saying like, oh yeah, well that's what we were looking for the whole time. There's a study that we use as a kind of like an entrance exam at Examine, which is
Yeah.
related to tart cherry juice and uh, delayed onset muscle soreness in athletes after doing some brutal back squat workout.
Mhm.
Um, and they tested all four heads of the quad, and none of them showed up as significant except for like the vastus lateralis. And so they framed this whole paper as basically like, hey, if you've got a sore vastus lateralis, like this tart cherry juice is for you. And by the way, here's the name of the company at the bottom of the paper. Um, and of course, realistically, it's like, well, I am 99% sure that neither the researchers nor the athletes or the scientists who are reading the paper are interested in one specific head of their quad muscle, right? Like you care about my leg hurts because I did too many squats and I
Big
want to.
picture. Yeah.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. And so, in all likelihood, what these researchers did was they realized that if they tested overall soreness of the leg, they wouldn't be able to generate a statistically significant outcome. But if they picked this one thing, they could. And so that's a term that's sometimes referred to as like p hacking. It's basically just saying like, well, we're gonna look for whatever provides statistical significance,
Yeah.
which typically means a what's called a p-value of less than 0.05. And then just say like, okay, well, we're gonna, we're just gonna say that that was it. So pre-registration helps protect you against that. One definite red flag is there are some studies that will pre-register and then still like say that they looked at different things in their paper, and you're like,
Mhm.
okay, like you literally just failed by your own standards, so I don't know what you're doing. But yeah, that's a big one. Similarly, failing to correct for multiple comparisons. So that's basically just saying every time you run a statistical test, there's a certain probability that you'll have either a false positive or a false negative. So, it's like a COVID test or something, right?
Yeah.
Like most of the time it's going to be right. Some of the time it's not going to be right. So if there's a certain probability of you getting a not true result when you run that test, the more times you run that test, the the closer to a guarantee that you get that you're going to end up with some false finding. A good way to think about it in my mind is if you roll one die, the probability of it landing on one is, you know, not so bad. But if you roll 100 dice, you're almost guaranteed. In fact, you're basically guaranteed to see at least a one in there. So these are all kind of examples of stats as kind of a particularly, I guess, useful part of the study to manipulate if you're looking to be misleading. So keeping an eye out for those kinds of things, and keeping an eye out for things like pre-registration to kind of help people appreciate. So just, to keep it so that people know what it is you were trying to do from the beginning.
We interrupt this conversation with Nick to quickly remind you that Examine 2.0 is now available. This is an awesome resource that covers 25 health categories, nearly 400 health conditions and goals, over 1,000 health outcomes and parameters, and over 500 interventions, mostly relating to supplements. These are people who have no conflict of interest, and as you're hearing from Nick in this podcast, they have a lot of important insights to help you save money and make sure that the supplements you buy are in fact effective. Just head to examine.news/Cressey. Again, examine.news/Cressey, CRESSEY, to get this special discount.
One of the things that you'd even mentioned to me, like as we were kind of talking about doing this, is this concept of, statistical significance, which we always have in the back of our head when we read research, and certainly something we're trained in when we go through, research methods and stats in class. But then the context of clinical significance, are they different in your mind? Are these points that should be differentiated?
Yeah, 100%. Because all that statistical significance is saying, kind of in basic terms, is just that, like, if you were to give me a value, I could kind of guess whether it would be part of the population that took the supplement or not. And that's a mathematical process, right? So it's not necessarily tied to intuition in any meaningful way, and it's certainly not tied to clinical outcomes. So a really good example of something that pertains to this would be like, okay, well, I might be able to, like let's say I run some sort of strength program, and I am somehow able to construct a strength program that provides the absolute minimum stimulus necessary to provoke some sort of hypertrophy. Like, it could be the case that, like, my program definitely increased my, the cross-sectional area of my hamstring, but maybe it was by such a small amount that it's like, all right, honestly, who cares? It would be like adding, a tenth of a pound to a 500-pound deadlift. So when you think about statistical significance versus clinical significance, it's important to kind of remember that just because you can mathematically claim that there's a difference between groups doesn't necessarily mean that you're likely to notice. And that kind of goes back to our initial discussion of, like, if you're going to bother taking something, you need to have ideally you have some idea that it's going to yield a benefit to you down the line. So like, if you wanted something that had high statistical significance and high clinical significance, it would be like, yeah, I ran a super intense strength program, and I definitely increased the cross-sectional area of my hamstring. And also, like, I noticed because my hamstring is visibly larger, or I can do a significantly higher, stronger Romanian deadlift or whatever.
Interesting. So we talked about how research can be misleading, how the actual research is bad. But sometimes well-intentioned people completely screw up when they read otherwise quality research. So what mistakes do you see people make when they're actually reading research?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing in this category is participant population. So it's very natural to say, like, okay, well, I want to boost my testosterone or whatever, right? So depending on who you are, the amount by which your testosterone needs to change is to evoke some sort of, like, meaningful difference in your life is going to be really significant, right? And so if you look at a study that looks at, like, DHEA and you see that it increases testosterone, it might be really tempting to say, like, okay, cool, this is a testosterone booster. I'm going to take it. I'm going to get huge. I'm going to, have an improved libido, like, whatever. But a lot of that research is done in postmenopausal women. And so you say, like, okay, well, like, that's not a problem. In fact, it's probably really good that population of people is being studied, but it's certainly not correct to assume that it's going to just all of a sudden apply to, like, you as a 17-year-old gym rat or whatever. I think to me that's definitely one of the biggest ones. We actually just recently covered um, it was some meta analyses. I believe it was related to like garlic supplementation or something. But basically discussing taking a supplement and its effect on cholesterol levels. And these two big meta analyses seem to kind of contest one another because one said we found a big effect and one said we didn't. And if you don't consider the population, there's basically no way to like reconcile these findings. But then you realize that it's like, oh wait, one of our populations was people who were already being treated for high blood cholesterol and they were taking cholesterol lowering drugs. And then the other group of people were people who weren't taking any medication whatsoever and didn't actually know that they had high cholesterol. So all you can really say there is like, well, that's just saying like if I'm already taking a very effective medication to lower my blood cholesterol, maybe taking garlic is not gonna matter. So to me, that's a really common issue that people can have when they see a study that looks promising, maybe supports something that they want, and then they just kind of gloss over that. Another thing that I think is really important to discuss is inappropriately extrapolating on mechanistic research. So you can have, when I say mechanistic research, I'm basically talking about things like studies conducted in bacteria or yeast or mice, or maybe like cats and dogs, although that's not super common. Um, so you have fundamentally like lab-based research that's being conducted to try to better understand some sort of very small process. So a good example of this might be something like understanding the role that NAD plays in like mitochondrial function. And it's totally legit to say like, well, here's a body of research that says that NAD is very, very important, and that maybe if you increase NAD in E. coli or in yeast, it has some sort of meaningful effect on like cell level metabolism. It's like, okay, cool, yeah, good deal. Does that mean you should be going and taking NAD supplements? It's like, well, absent human research, that may not be true. And so like NAD is a good example of like, it seems like the research really depends, right? Like it depends on the form that it's taking and how you're taking it. So there's a chance that like you're going to eat all this stuff, hoping that it's going to like, kickstart your metabolism or whatever. And then all of a sudden, you've just eaten a bunch of stuff that's not even getting into the part of the cell where it needs to be for things to happen. So it's very tempting to look at mechanistic research. Intermittent fasting is another good example of a field that has this problem, in my opinion. People say like, oh, well, autophagy, this is gonna have all these incredible like metabolic effects. And there's human research that's now being done that is helping kind of flesh that out. But I personally think that people are making pretty strong claims about that stuff, maybe a little bit earlier than was appropriate, given the research that was available.
I mean, and I think that's just the nature of the industry on the whole, right? Is like we would like to jump to enthusiasm and excitement about what's new, whatever it is. We love to throw our money at it, even if
Right.
there isn't necessarily merit behind it. And certainly, like you mentioned, DHEA, like it's a banned substance, and
Right.
it's a big concern for a lot of the athletes that would be listening to this, is to how to stay away from it. So I think that becomes the question as well. It's, what are the concerns? And maybe this is even beyond like a research, question, as much an application question, but, there's compounds and then there's companies, right? So there may be legitimate supplements that may be made in factories that also have banned substances in them. So, like, what are the safeguards that you recommend for athletes to know they're actually getting what they're researching?
Yeah. So to me, the best thing that you can focus on is high quality third party testing. That's basically the system that has formed in the United States as a solution to the fact that regulation of dietary supplements is, formal regulation is non-existent. So you'll see that like this statement has not been evaluated by the FDA. This is basically them just saying like, hey, look, like we washed our hands of this, and by the way, like absent very obvious cases, the safety of a supplement is typically something where you need to take the supplement, experience a bad side effect, report it, and then it gets pulled from the market.
Yeah.
So the burden of proof of harm is on the consumer, which obviously, like both from a personal health perspective, but then also from a not failing a drug test perspective, that's a problem. So there are a lot of different third-party sites that do this. I actually think that Amazon may have even created standards like you must
Interesting.
meet certain third-party standards. I don't know that for sure, so I wouldn't take that as a wholesale endorsement. But there are organizations like Informed Sport that or like there's a website that I've used in the past called Labdoor. Like there's a lot of these different organizations that'll basically say, hey, we took a batch of this supplement, we broke it down, and we can characterize one is how much of the actual ingredient of interest was present. You said there was going to be 20 grams of protein a
Yeah.
serving. There was only 18. But then also we'll test for contaminants. So we'll
Yeah.
say like, okay, is there stuff that's harmful for your health? But then also, you know, maybe that like
Yeah.
gas station mass gainer that you took that
Yeah.
could have anabolic steroids in it. That's actually something that does happen. So
Yeah.
looking for high quality third party testing is basically the most important.
Yeah. And I'd say over the past 10 to 15 years in Major League Baseball, there's just been a heavy push to just emphasize NSF certified for sport products. Like that's
Yep.
kind of the go-to. And
NSF too.
yeah, and that's the biggest conversation I think you have with athletes is one of our major leaguers this past offseason had a sweat tablet, like an electrolyte solution that he absolutely loved and was just really confident that it made a big difference for him playing in the heat and things like that. And he's like, it's not NSF certified. Should I be worried? And I'm like, well, probably not, but why would you risk it when there's more NSF certified tablets out there that you can utilize that are in every athletic trainer's suitcase. Why risk it? So maybe it leads to this next question is what's the level of evidence one should have before taking a supplement, right? You implied early on like there's this almost like this risk assessment. What kind of benefit are you hoping for? Obviously, something like an electrolyte solution is important, right? If you're playing in 95-degree weather with 100% humidity and you're a prime candidate for cramping, like that's something that can be very impactful for your performance. You want to have that in your back pocket, but at the same time, like the last thing you want to do is take something that could get you into trouble for all the wrong reasons.
Right. Yeah. So I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to risk assessment as being kind of the driver of this. So, in terms of risk assessment, breaking it down into basically three parts, right? Like there's hazards. So the thing that could happen, there's likelihood. So the likelihood that thing happens, and then tolerance, which is how tolerant are you to that thing happening to you? And once again, this is at least a somewhat personal decision. So thinking about like what it is that you have to lose is really important. So for some people, it might just be like, oh, well, maybe I'll waste some money, or maybe I'll waste some time. Maybe I'll waste some energy. You could have situations where it's like, I'm actually risking my health potentially if I'm taking, a particular supplement that really doesn't have a lot of research on it. And then obviously I'm risking failing a drug test is a really important consideration for athletes. So you sort of have to, look at all of those things in total. And ultimately it is going to come down to a judgment call to some degree. So my own personal attitude, I am not a competitive athlete. I'm not concerned about failing a drug test, although I don't really like the idea that I would be taking drugs without knowing it. So in that case, basically I try to think about it as like the value of a supplement can be thought of as the sum of like the effect that I can see and its cost kind of added together. Or rather, okay, so I misspoke on that. So basically the effect that I can have and the basically degree to which I'm willing to tolerate the negative side effects, and then sort of divided by cost. And or maybe thinking about things like reliability as well. So something like whey protein, it's kind of like, okay, it's pretty cheap, it's very well studied. There are not major risks associated with it. So this is a really good candidate for basically just like, yeah, you basically just like take this. If you think you want to take this, then you can probably just take this, barring, very specific medical conditions. So yeah, that's kind of like the way that I like to think about it when it comes to like deciding what to take. I think generally speaking, if you're looking to have sort of a nice balanced and fairly risk averse standpoint, I would recommend saying like, okay, you want to ideally either have like a position statement on this from some organization that you trust, or like a really kind of well-conducted review article or a meta-analysis on the subject. That's basically just saying, hey, there's been enough stuff on this subject that we can sum it all together and get an overall idea of like what this effect actually is going to be. And the good thing about meta-analyses is that they also describe effect size, and that should be ideally independent of any measurement scale they use. And so they can say sort of like, all right, you're going to notice this, or someone who's trained might notice this, but you might not notice this if you're not paying attention, or this is definitely going to do something, but also be prepared to not notice. Yeah, to me, those are kind of the important things. Look for a large and summed body of evidence.
So we've talked a lot about, research processes, how to watch out for the bad apples, how to avoid misinterpreting it. I'm curious as we get more applied, right? Like you've obviously reviewed a large body of evidence, for good and for bad, right? And I'm curious, when you think of the demographic that listens to this podcast, obviously it's players, coaches, parents, of young athletes. When you go through these risk assessments and you look at, whether the juice is worth the squeeze on all these, are there certain supplements that you do feel are really just they're must-haves for athletes, in the, we'll say the 17 to 30 age range, like our classic high school, college, professional baseball player?
Yeah, 100%. And so before I go into the specifics, I think one thing that's really important to remember is that thinking about how much does supplementation factor into someone's overall performance. I think it is really important to remember that it's like, all right, look, like whether or not I'm taking whey protein is probably not going to matter too much if I'm still like dramatically under or overeating. Yeah. Or, if I'm sleeping 3 hours a night and I have like some super stressful life, like I can promise you like no amount of rhodiola rosea or whatever is gonna change the fact that I'm gonna feel bad when I'm training or in life. So thinking about the fact that it's like, okay, supplements sort of represent like maybe the top 5 to 10% of performance is important to consider. So in terms of specific things, so just as a general person, I think taking like vitamin D is a good idea. This is sort of an interesting case because it has a lot of observational research, and the interventional research doesn't necessarily play out exactly the way we expect. But regardless, I think of it as like, well, the likelihood of it being a problem when you take it is quite low. And it seems like there's a strong enough association with a lot of different useful health outcomes that it's probably still worth taking anyway. As an athlete specifically, thinking about things like focusing on strength and cardiovascular health and recovery, I think creatine is an absolute yes. I think that if you are an endurance athlete, you are less likely to notice the benefits and might be able to skip out on it. But I also, as far as I know, so the health risks are extremely rare. It's one of the most well studied and safe supplements that exists. So like either you take it and you waste a couple bucks a month and you don't notice it, or you do something like strength and you very well might notice that. Similarly, I think whey protein is very important. So obviously, like any sort of athlete is going to be undergoing a lot of physiological stress, and they're going to be producing muscle damage. And ensuring adequate protein intake is a very important part of recovering and then improving following that recovery period. And whey protein is once again, very safe, very low risk way to ensure that you're getting a very important dimension of your nutrition. I think caffeine within reason is also an important thing to consider. So obviously you can definitely overdo it. Some people are quite sensitive to caffeine, but as an ergogenic aid, so as a strength and power increasing aid, also as a way of increasing pain tolerance and alertness, all of those things are well studied and are very much beneficial to a wide variety of athletes. If you're worried about kind of getting anxious when you take it, taking L-theanine alongside it is a pretty reliable way to dampen those effects and kind of, smooth out the kind of more unpleasant elements of taking caffeine. Another thing related to kind of general sports performance that I like is basically anything related to nitric oxide production. So that could be something like citrulline malate, which is part of the urea. So citrulline is part of the urea cycle, which is basically the main way by which we generate nitric oxide in the body, or something like beetroot extract, which contains a lot of nitrates. And the way nitric oxide works is it basically it plays a very important role in blood vessel function. So you're putting your body under significant stress. Your muscles and other tissues are going to demand oxygen, and having a well-functioning cardiovascular system is going to be a very important part of delivering oxygen and other nutrients to cells as quickly as possible. When it comes to recovery, I think that if athletes experience sleep-related issues, I think melatonin is a very good option. Once again, very safe, easy to take, hard to overdo within reason, and can be an extremely useful tool, especially if you're like, if you're hurting real bad and you're having a hard time falling asleep, that can help. Or if you're traveling, and you have to deal with time changes. So in terms of like, maybe baseball players specifically, the thing that kind of screams to me is joint health and managing inflammation. So in that respect, I think fish oil, curcumin, chondroitin, which is often paired with glucosamine and collagen, are all really good options. So fish oil and curcumin, I especially have a lot of faith in. They have really good mechanistic evidence that supports their role in managing inflammation. And then there are a lot of human trials that back that up, both in terms of measuring markers of inflammation in the blood, and then also people like experiential outcomes, like my knees don't hurt as bad or my shoulder doesn't hurt as bad. And so that's kind of how I would sort through things. That's how I would sort through everything when it comes to that. And obviously, I guess depending on how much time and money and tolerance you have for taking a ton of supplements, you could throw everything on this list. If you wanted to be super minimalist, I would basically say, vitamin D, creatine, whey protein, and a pre-workout that has caffeine and something related to nitric oxide, and that'll set you up pretty well.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be complex, and the thing I always come back to too is there are plenty of people who have done it without supplements, who have been intelligent with their nutrition, and it's just that it's something that supports or supplements a comprehensive diet and hydration status and in quality lifestyle factors, that pair alongside a good training program. But these are all vitally important considerations. I guess on the flip side, are there ergogenic attempts, things that are out there that are marketed heavy to athletes, even if you don't go into like the nitty gritty of the research, but ones that you would tell athletes to absolutely stay away from right now based on the body of evidence that you've reviewed, I should say?
So I would say that generally speaking, my aversion to particular compounds is more when things are being kind of mixed together and there's a lot of ambiguity about what's actually going in.
Proprietary blends.
Right, exactly. And so, you end up in situations where you say like, okay, I'm going to spend, $50 on some like super premium pre-workout, and great, it has caffeine, and oh, great, maybe it has something, like citrulline malate or beetroot extract. But it's like, it has a ton of caffeine, and it also has like all these random other things where it's like, okay, like, look, like, I think it's fine for someone to decide as an individual, like, here's something that has a small amount of research and I'm willing to take a risk with it. But I don't necessarily like the idea of just consuming those things wholesale. So most of my aversion to those products is related to just like, look, like your body's a temple. That's no more evident than with an athlete, right? It's like, you need this thing to work correctly, and ideally you should know what's going into it. One thing that I would generally, as more or less a blanket recommendation, encourage people to avoid is things like fat burners. My main objection to things like that are the fact that they tend to contain stimulants. So it's easy to overdo it in terms of like, oh, like this has yohimbine in it, which has a stimulant effect. It has ephedra in it, or something similar. Or maybe it also has caffeine in it. It's a really big strain on your cardiovascular system, and it's also very easy to end up in a situation where you end up taking 2 of them instead of 1, and all of a sudden you're like in a really bad way because the dosages per pill are so high. I think that when it comes to like managing weight loss in athletics, obviously, like, there are some sports where weight loss is a very important part of things. And, if you have to cut weight, if you have to do water cutting to lose weight for, like an MMA fight, or, weighing in, like rowing actually was a sport where some people have to do that. Like, do what you got to do from that perspective. But I don't typically endorse the use of supplements to support that, because there are non-supplement options that are much more control. They're easier to control. And I think that when it comes to something like weight loss, like that should be something that is paid very close attention to and done in a very controlled manner.
Absolutely. Well, this is super informative, as is examine.com. I have been a long-term supporter of it. Sol is a good friend. We go way back to, my gosh, probably 2009. talk to me a little bit about, and more so talk to our listeners a little about what Examine offers, what they'd curious about checking out, particularly, a lot of the fitness professionals, strength and conditioning coaches, and nutritionists that listen.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, Examine is broadly speaking split into two parts. The first part, I kind of call it like supplement and diet Wikipedia. So we have these topic pages where we say, okay, like I want to learn everything there is to know about creatine. So you search creatine in our search bar. You have both written text that describes like, what is this? How should I take it? How much should I take? When should I take it? What are its purported benefits? But then also we have a study database. It's currently called the Human Effect Matrix, and it basically describes per outcome what is the magnitude of effect you expect to see, or is seen in scientific literature. How consistent is that particular outcome, and how many studies have been conducted, and then we provide an overall evaluation. So an example of that in creatine would be, creatine has a very strong positive effect on power output, and there are 100 studies that show this, and they are very consistent. So that's very helpful when it comes to looking at specifically like, okay, I want to get stronger. What supplements could support that? We try to be very clear about that and very quantitative about that. The other half of the site, which is the part of the site that I manage, is called Study Summaries. It's basically a research digest, and we cover about 200 new nutrition and supplement articles every month. So the goal with that system is basically to provide what we call like an abstract plus one. So there are these short, punchy summaries of scientific literature that are both contain all of the important details, like who was studied, when was studied, when was it studied, how long was it studied for, all that stuff, what were the results, but then also an extra layer of analysis and context that helps you make a little bit better use of that. On top of that, when we have really interesting subjects, we cover them as editors' picks, and that's more long form, like, okay, let's really dig in this and understand what there is to be understood about this subject. And that's particularly beneficial. Like a lot of the people who read that are, PTs and dietitians and people who have some sort of like clinical role, because staying up to date is well, it's very difficult. And we've basically made it our business to find ways to do that effectively, and then to help people understand.
I read it every month and look forward to it. It has been something that's allowed me to cover a lot more journals than I would ever be able to do on my own. So I respect what you guys do, and I can only imagine covering 200 studies a month. That's not easy.
Thank you. We've got a very, very good team of very smart people, and that's the only way it works.
Well, it shows. But Nick, can't thank you enough for joining us. This has been awesome, as has the content the crew at Examine has put out over the years. So thanks for taking the time and for sharing your expertise.
Oh yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Eric.